Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening. So, this is a beautiful photograph of Martin Luther King Jr. And so, a lot of times we have seen photos like this, and he stands out in the American society as a hero. He's a great man, and he's always celebrated on his birthday. And he's done a lot of great things for Black history. And I don't think that young people realize that this man was not treated the way that we see him today or how he's celebrated today. And so there's a lot of contrary um, rhetoric where people will make him seem like he's a white and Black people equally revered Martin Luther King Jr., but it was I thought that these articles were really, really, really important. And so I'm going to read a couple of articles. So bear with me. And so the first article is entitled, it's in the LA Times, Martin Luther King's Death Tore America Apart. And we still can't reckon with African American demands for justice. And so that's one article that I was reading. And it was very interesting because a lot of young people are wondering why there's so many protests and there's so many things that are going on that have caused so much destruction in what has been happening today. And so I just wanted people to realize that there's a history behind all of this, that this is nothing new. And a lot of young people, it's sad because they want to blame the people before them, but you can't, because these battles have been fought before we were here, before your parents were here. And the same things that you're fighting for are the same things your parents were fighting for and your parents' parents were fighting for. And so this article, I will, without further ado, I'll read a couple of articles I thought were really, really important as to what kinds of things are going on and why they're going on the way they are. And so that this is nothing new. Don't be surprised at what is happening. And so I'm going to go on, and if I can't get this article back, let me see here. I'm trying to pull down on this article and go through it, but there's a lot of interference. This one right here, actually, I had put this on Twitter, and I think in me doing so, I get a lot of interference. So I might jump around a bit. So despite what people think, there's a lot that has gone on in the past. And a lot of people don't realize that the past definitely shapes the future. And so I believe maybe all these interferences is what's causing this not to really come up very clear. But let me start off with this. This photo here that you see of Dr. Martin Luther King. Okay, I'm probably on the wrong page. Okay. Sometimes when you have too many things pulled up. Okay, so let me read this. You probably heard me reading another title. I'll see if I can pull it up. But anyway, this title here says, "Don't forget that Martin Luther King Jr. was once denounced as an extremist." So I will get right into reading it. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was addressing a crowd of demonstrators outside of Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This was back in 1963. And so this article was written by Jeanne Theoharis. And as Monday observance This is back in January 12th. This was when we were celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream and his birthday and whatnot. This happens every year. So this article goes on to say, as Monday's observance of Martin Luther King Jr. Day approaches, King's I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington is sure to be celebrated and replayed across the country of the U.S. In today's popular imagination, the March on Washington stands as one of the most American events of the 20th century. The power of the U.S. democracy made real in 250,000 people who gathered on the National Mall and the majesty of King's speech that August day. At the time, however, that was not the case. In 1963, most Americans disapproved of the event. Many congressmen saw it as potentially seditious, and a law enforcement from the local police FBI monitored it intensively under the code name Operation Steep Hill. Indeed, it was after King's speech at March on Washington that the FBI, with President Kennedy's approval, decided to increase their monitoring of the civil rights leader. So the FBI describing King as a demagogic and the most dangerous to the nation from the standpoint of national security. So Attorney General Robert Kennedy signed off on intrusive surveillance of his living quarters, offices, phones, hotel rooms, as well as those of his associates. Fast forwarding today, half a century, and many commentators, from former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee and CNN reporter Wolf Blitzer to Atlanta Mayor Kazim Reed, have chastised Black Lives Matter protesters and protests for not living up to the legacy of civil rights movement and called on them to be more like Martin Luther King. Our popular memory of the civil rights movement makes it seem as if most decent people were in favor of the movement, but in reality, it was on the contrary, they were not. Many of the criticisms lobbed at Black Lives Matter today were also leveled against civil rights activists 5 decades ago. So civil rights movement was deeply unpopular at the time, and most Americans thought it was going to be too far, and the movement activists were being too extreme. So some thought that its goals were wrong and other activists were going about it the wrong way. And most white Americans were happy with the status quo as it was. They didn't want integration, they wanted segregation to remain. So they criticized, monitored, and demonized. And at the time, they criminalized those who challenged the way things were, making dissent very costly. So most modern tributes and understandings of the movement paper over the decades when activists like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and scores of others comrades were criticized by fellow citizens and targeted as un-American, not just by Southern politicians, but also by the federal government. So in the 1960s, the vast majority of white people, South and North, disapproved of the movement tactics. So in May of 1961, the Gallup survey, only 22% of Americans approved of the Freedom Riders were doing and what they were doing. 57% of Americans said that the sit-ins at the lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations by Negroes were hurting the Negro chances of being integrated in the South. And just before the March on Washington, Gallup found 23% of the Americans had favorable opinions of the proposed civil rights demonstrations. So least we see this as Southerners skewering the national sample. The 1964, a year before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, a New York Times poll found a majority of 57% of New Yorkers said that the civil rights movement had gone too far. So while denying the deep-seated prejudice, the Times reported a large number of those questioned used the same terms to express their feelings. They spoke of Negroes receiving everything on a silver platter and reverse discrimination against whites. So 54% of those surveyed felt that the movement was going too fast. Nearly half said that picketing and demonstrations hurt the Negro cause, and 80% opposed school pairings to promote school desegregation in New York City public schools. Nationally, white people's support of the civil rights movement continued to be low throughout the 1960s. In 1966, a year after Selma, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, only 36% of the white people said that King was helping the cause. 85% of white people surveyed said the demonstrations by Negroes and civil rights hurt the advancement of that cause. While 30% of Black respondents felt the same, 72% of the Americans had an unfavorable view of Dr. Martin Luther King. So while many people of all races admired King and Rosa Parks in the 1960s, the majority of Americans did not find or found that the civil rights movement was both wrong and unnecessary. Activists like Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were reviled, red-baited, and called extremists in their own time. On the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, white citizens' councils had plastered huge billboards along the route in which King and Rosa Parks were pictured attending a communist training school, actually Highlander Folk School. And when newly elected Congressman John Conyers decided to hire Rosa Parks to work in his Detroit office in 1965, he was deluged with hate mail, threatening calls, watermelons, voodoo dolls, and other racist trinkets, informing Parks and Conyers that she was not wanted in the North. The last time King and Rosa Parks saw each other was at the speech that King had gave in the elite Detroit suburbs of Grosse Pointe, Michigan in March of 1968, a month before he was assassinated. King said it was the most disruptive meeting that he had ever faced in the indoor meeting that he was at. And Detroit News, he later reported. He was called a traitor so many times that night, he finally interjected, "We're going to have a question and answer period, and if you think I'm a traitor, then you have the opportunity to ask me about my traitorness." That was end quote. That was what King responded. A half century later, in our popular celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King, this relentless nationwide opposition of civil rights movement is usually left out. So you don't hear about this every year when they're celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King. They make it seem as though he was a hero and he was respected by all people, and that was not the case back then. So as the world honors King's life, it has been or becomes more comfortable to celebrate the civil rights movement of the 1960s as if leaders were uncontroversial except among small racist minority. That's what they would have you to believe. They make it seem as though there was a small group that was the aggressors against the civil rights movement, but it was actually a larger group than that. And so today, modern civil rights movements such as Black Lives Matter face charges of supposed extremism, much like Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. So the FBI has identified this today as called, quote, Black identity extremism as a new domestic threat. And so the president slams NFL quarterback Colin Kirkpatrick, or Kaepernick. I said Kirkpatrick, Kaepernick, for disrespecting our country. And so we conveniently forget that Dr. Martin Luther King and Parks faced similar charges back then when they were living, missing the historical continuities in the ways Black critics of America's injustice have been treated then and now, even today. And so I thought this was an important piece to read because it sheds light on how people really felt about Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks when they were living. So a lot of what you're hearing from people is not always what people were treated like when they were living. And so I wanted to go back into this article. I'll find it because it also sheds light on how Dr. Martin Luther King was treated as well. And so I had found it earlier. I think it was on, I had posted it on Twitter. So it's entitled Martin Luther King's Death Tore Apart America, or America Apart, and We Still Can't Reckon. And so I'll click into it. And it may be blocked or it may not be blocked. So I will unblock it. I will find it on another page. But I'm going to quickly skip over to some photos. Let me see here. I'm actually going to get out of this and close it off. And so bear with me for a moment because I had actually found some photos of Selma, Alabama, and I always wanted to see what is happening in some of those places and have there been any improvements in what has happened from long ago, and unfortunately not. And so Martin. And so I'll be honest with you that by me sharing some of these articles and saying the things that I'm saying, even though I'm not posting anything threatening, I could be labeled as what they're saying because I'm talking a lot about Black issues and a lot about, politics and some of the things that have been going on. And so sometimes people take things in a way out of proportion to make it seem as though that you're creating some type of climate of trouble. And that's the contrary. That's not, it's more like historical facts, things that have happened in the past to explain why things are happening now, and more a Q&A and what types of things can be done to resolve the things that are happening to make life more comfortable for people so that they don't feel like they have to be in fear. But right now, people are in fear because it's very uncertain because of some of the shootings. It's not just some shootings, it's been a lot of shootings, rather. And then there's other issues that have happened even outside of the Black community that have been troubling. Some of the places that you would think were safe don't feel safe anymore, like churches, schools. Some of the things that have been erupting more recently has got young people even on edge, and they're wondering where is all of these things coming from, because it seems like there's so many protests and so many causes that people are wanting to be a part of, but they're not knowing where all this is coming from. And so a lot of this, there is an originator of why some of these things are. And so I remember this young lady online, she was like, she was really hostile, and it was almost like she wanted to blame people that were a generation above her, like people like maybe her parents or people her parents' age. Well, I'm here to tell you that a lot of this stuff was here even before your parents' parents and your grandparents. It's been here. It's just a repeat. And I've always said this, it's a repeat of history. It's nothing new. And a lot of times you have to really read about history and how people were treated and what things happened to understand what's going on today, to have a better grasp at what you're seeing seeing and what you're viewing and be more aware. These things are wake-up calls is what it is. And so I was thinking, and so I was trying to be savvy and see if I could find the article again. And so I was successful at that because I had to have something that was coinciding with this article so that you can see from this what happened. So this is a photo of Dr. Martin Luther King as well. So I'm going to see if I can actually pull this up because I don't know if that's showing right now. Oh, yeah, it is. So I was trying to see if it was showing, but this is like a statue, and it's a nice statue. There's a lot of statues, a lot of memorials and commemorating of Dr. Martin Luther King when he was alive. Um, it was different, of course. Now that he's not here, you know, I guess nobody feels threatened like they did when he was here. And so I'll read this. Because Martin Luther King Jr. now stands as exalted hero of American history, we tend to assume that his assassination 50 years ago was experienced as a national tragedy. Yet in the days and the weeks after his death on April 4th, 1968, Americans not only mourned and grieved, but also seethed and raged. And so there were some people who weren't that happy about Dr. Martin Luther King. And so he wasn't viewed by everyone as a hero. So President Lyndon Johnson, I almost said Lyndon B. Johnson. So he designated April the 7th, Palm Sunday that year, as a national day of mourning. On April 9th, 120 million people watched King's funeral on television. And so Americans were not unified by a collective grief. Some whites were incredulous at the president's proclamation and marveled that ministers would deliver eulogies for a man they considered a communist agitator. Others even celebrated King's death. So I want you young people to hear that, because a lot of young people, somehow they're confused. And when I was younger, they made it sound as though that everybody likes Martin Luther King. He was like the good black guy. He wasn't like Malcolm X. He wasn't a troublemaker. But that's the way they made it seem. So riots decimated parts of Washington, Chicago, and other cities. Many whites were angered and frightened by the violent eruptions more than they were beset by the loss of King. So there were millions of Americans, black and white, who peacefully honored the slain civil rights leader and committed themselves to King's dream of a beloved community of racial justice and interracial harmony. But that dream was very much in doubt even before King's death. His assassination helped to extinguish it. This was a corrosive time, and a time when the divisions in American society, political, social, and most of the all racial, burst to the fore when the nation threatened to crack in two. And so it was a time not unlike our own. And so if you're seeing all this stuff, people getting shot and some of the anger and the protests, it's nothing new. It's just now we have new instances, things coming up that are also lumped in the pot. So now, as then, a segment of white America views all forms of Black protest as unacceptable and unpatriotic. There may not be a straight line that runs from Martin Luther King Jr. the prophet and the nonviolence, to Colin Kaepernick, the former San Francisco 49er quarterback who knelt during the national anthem, and others who have joined the Black Lives Matter movement. But the white hatred directed at King and these modern day civil rights protesters have some 5 decades later is remarkably similar. So King's detractors claim that he was inflammatory and that he actually created violence. And when Bull Connor unleashed his attack dogs on Black protesters in Birmingham, or Jim Clark's posse fractured the skulls of marchers in Selma on Edmund Pettus Bridge, whites blame King and his followers for helping to produce that violence. So went the argument back then. King attracted the most widespread scorn of his anti-war activism. In a speech at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in February 1967, King insisted that he opposed the Vietnam War because I love America, end quote, and because I am disappointed with America. In April of 1967, in a sermon at Riverside Church in New York City, King called America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He feared that his nation was approaching spiritual death. Newspaper editors rebuked King, political leaders denounced him, and death threats intensified. In King's last campaign, he traveled to Memphis early in 1968 to assist striking sanitation workers. 1,300 Black men degrading conditions for meager wages. On March 28, 1968, King led a march during which some of the protesters behind him turned violent. So it goes on to say, and pardon me for a minute there. And so I believe a lot of times what happens is when you start to speak out and you start to talk about things that are real and things that are actually happening or have real life, people begin to get afraid because the truth is coming out. And so they do things to try to silence you, or they try to interfere with things that you're talking about because they don't want the truth to come out. They don't want honesty to come out about how people really felt about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And so, like I said, King led a march during which some of the protesters behind him, they turned violent. His critics thought that this clinched their argument. And Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia called King a self-seeking rabble-rouser who undoubtedly encouraged the violence in Memphis. So Republican Dan Kuyakendo of Tennessee accused King of being an agitating destruction, violence, and hatred. The criticism continued even after King's murder days later down the road. So upon hearing of the assassination, Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina decried King as an outside agitator bent on stirring people up, making everyone dissatisfied. And so that's pretty much like how people treat people today when they want to speak out on some of the issues that are happening in American society. So many white Americans thought King had received his just desserts. In other words, they were happy that he was assassinated. The ones that were feeling the ills of him and his movement back then, they felt that he was an agitator. So the leaders of the government pay homage to a rabble-rouser, riotous insurgent, lamented Shelbyville, Tennessee resident Richard Brantley in a letter to the Nashville Tennessean. So I am sick to my soul, end quote. So in our times, African American protesters are similarly met with the same hostility and loathe. When Kaepernick devised his national anthem protest in 2016, he consulted with veterans precisely because he wished to express himself in a way that would not be perceived as an attack on the nation or military. So he wanted to raise awareness about racial injustice, particularly the killing of Black men by police officers. But he was despised and lambasted and ultimately run out of the NFL, or the National Football League. In September of 2017, President Trump reignited the controversy when he advised NFL owners to fire any sons of a bitch who took a knee during the Star Spangled Banner. So many white Americans continue to view any criticism of the nation as disloyalty, especially if the critics are African American. Debating Tommy Lahren, the Fox News contributor who gained fame for her caustic criticism of Kaepernick, The Daily Show, Trevor Noah wondered how African Americans ought to exercise their First Amendment rights, if not through peaceful protests like Kaepernick's. Here's a Black man in America who says, I don't know how to get a message across. If I march in the streets, people say I'm a thug. If I go out and I protest, people say it's a riot. What's the right way for a Black person to get attention in America? Lahren dodged that question. King's legacy has had, by 2016, become thoroughly sanitized. So that means they've made him seem like he's this hero and he's equally liked by both Blacks and whites, or all whites. Not all whites received King the same way. And there were people that criticized him. And I believe there was fear from Black people who feared that they would be retaliated against if there was integration. So they were on the side of denouncing as well. I'm sure there were people that probably were, even back then in that time, if they were Black, they were like, no, this is not the time to come and speak out. And they were in fear. So conservatives even invoke King in their denunciation of Black Lives Matter movement. Bill O'Reilly charged the Dr. Martin Luther King would not participate in Black Lives Matter protests. I'm going to read up here. I'm going to digress. King's legacy had by 2016 become thoroughly sanitized, so many white Americans embraced him as a voice of colorblindness and conveniently forgot about his own confrontational acts of civil disobedience. And so here, conservatives, like on Fox News, they used him as talking points to go against other people or Blacks. Conservatives even invoke King in their denunciation of Black Lives Matter. So Bill O'Reilly was one, and I've heard him say many things using Dr. Martin Luther King, making him seem like he's such a hero and he was liked by all, and they leave out the parts of how they treated Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks back in that time. And so Dr. Martin Luther King would not participate in Black Lives Matter protests. Mike Huckabee claimed that King would be appalled by the notion that we're elevating some lives and above others. So Clemson's football coach, Dabo Swinney, recommended that Black Lives Matter protesters heed King's shining example. I think the answer to our problems is exactly what they were for Martin Luther King when he changed the world: love, peace, education, tolerance of others, Jesus. So of these critics missed something fundamental. Of all of them, they've missed something very fundamental. King was a man who criticized his country and who condemned the unpatrioticness in his own day, and who paralyzed American critics with massive street demonstrations, much like people are doing now, speaking out. So he was a person that spoke out against injustice. So after King's death in 1968, African Americans took to the streets, some in violent revolt and others in peaceful and interracial marches. And in turn, politicians such as George Wallace, Richard Nixon promised a law and order crackdown. Nixon exploited white voters' racial anger en route to the White House. 2016, this story seems hauntingly seems familiar. Unarmed Black men have been gunned down in our streets, yet many white Americans remain unmoved by the acts of racial violence. Their response has not been to call for justice, but to support a president who has empowered and emboldened white supremacists. So while King tried to bring the races together during his lifetime, his death illuminated the depths of white racism, just as it has accelerated Black militancy and helped to break the races further apart. We now stand in the wake of a vicious backlash against our first Black president and confront a world in which Black lives remain ununiquely threatened. So it is 5 decades since King's murder, but the same white rage tears at our social fabric. And so I thought this article really sums up what is going on today. And this is in the LA Times. And so I know enough of these articles. If you want to see this article's in the LA Times, and it's entitled Martin Luther King's Death Tore America Apart. We still can't reckon with African American demands for justice. And this is by Jason Sokol in the LA Times. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to click off of this. And then the other article is also about Martin Luther King. And that's the one where it talks about how he was treated and Rosa Parks was treated. Don't forget that Martin Luther King Jr. was once denounced as an extremist. And so here he is pictured here. This is a beautiful picture of him. And back then. And so he was once denounced as an extremist. So I'm going to click off of this. And then I'm going to go to Selma. You ever wondered what Selma looks like? You ever wondered what Selma might look like? Well, I've wondered what Selma might look like, because after that incident, the historical incident on the bridge, I've wondered, how is Selma and what is it like there? And is it changed since Dr. Martin Luther King days? And so here's some photos, and I'm going to start. This is going backwards. Selma is poverty stricken. So this is a memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. outside of a historic Brown Chapel Church in Selma. So I'm starting at the back here. This is his I Have a Dream plaque, and this is in front of a church. They gave their lives underneath the I Have a Dream. Let's take a look and see what's going on. Now, some of the photos are not of Selma, so I'll skip over those. They might be of pictures of actors and actresses, but you'll see storefronts, you'll see houses and businesses that are totally abandoned. And some places that aren't abandoned, people are in poverty. So this just looks like a house where somebody's staying. Doesn't look that great. Okay, so this is poverty-stricken Selma, Alabama. This is today. And these are a lot of businesses that are closed up. This is a crumbling shell of an old grocery store in Selma, Alabama, where roughly 41% of the population lives below the poverty level. This is to give you a clue of what people are going through. So in 1965, this is a photo of Martin Luther King Jr. with others, leaders behind President Lyndon B. Johnson. I was right, Lyndon B. Johnson. As he signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, is displayed behind a shattered window in downtown Selma. And so it's possibly a business that isn't open anymore. And so this is a boarded up home. And this is a Confederate flag near a grave at a Confederate cemetery. And this is looks like a structure, like maybe a road. It looks like a deserted town, and it not much is going on. And so this is boarded up as well. Many structures that are broken or cracked are boarded up. It's a broken bench outside of an abandoned storefront in the downtown of Selma. And this is Selma right here. It's poverty-stricken Selma, Alabama. Boarded up storefront on the main strip in downtown Selma. And this is a cat that wanders through an abandoned area where there's an abandoned house. This, you see signs of for sale for businesses because there is no money being made in these areas. So it's a for sale sign on an empty building in downtown Selma. And this is an abandoned house in Selma, Alabama, where roughly once again, 41% of the population lives below the poverty level. An abandoned storefront. You'll see a lot of murals that honor Selma's history and Martin Luther King, but no activity is going on. There's no money being generated in those areas. A mural honoring Selma's history in the civil rights movement on the side of an abandoned building in downtown Selma. This is another boarded up storefront in downtown Selma where roughly 41% of the population lives below poverty level. And this is another part of Selma. Looks like train tracks. This would have been a hair salon. This is a handmade sign of a beauty salon in Selma. And this is an abandoned church in Selma. This is an abandoned restaurant. It has a hamburger that's painted on the side, and it's in downtown Selma. This is an abandoned building here as well, broken out windows. You see that the lot is unkept, overgrown grass, a statue of a ghost on display in downtown Selma. It's pretty much how the town is. These are mannequins in a store window downtown Selma where many storefronts are empty. And you'll see that historical sign. This is a gas station that's been converted into a church. And this right here is also, it says on here, the mural, never forget, never forget, never again. That's, you can tell it was at one time a gas station, but now it's converted into a church. And this is a mural, and this is, looks like a store. Might not have very much activity going on. A cat sits on a gravesite at a Confederate soldiers cemetery in Selma, Alabama. Empty storefront in downtown Selma. You see the for sale sign for rent. Boys walk down an alley behind abandoned businesses in downtown Selma. And it's a long view, but there's two little boys walking down there. And this is a street that was named after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it's also says Selma. And it's an abandoned house. And this is the famous Edmund Pettus Bridge in downtown Selma, where the voting rights marchers were attacked by the law endorsement on Bloody Sunday in 1965. And this is where Bloody Sunday began in the area, and it has the mural on there. It says March 7, 1965. And this is also an abandoned place. Looks like it might have been a store, a grocery store. And this right here, it says only Jesus can save USA, pray. And it looks like there might be some activity going on there, but not much is going on in terms of economics, like money. So a home in Selma where roughly 41% of the population lives, below the poverty level. And this is a home right here. It looks like this might be the homes where some people do live. And this is more right here, empty buildings in downtown Selma. These are buildings what would have been in the downtown area, but they're totally empty. So it's like an open lot. This is a mural of Martin Luther King and Edmund Pettus Bridge over the top of his mural. And this is right here, this is a sign advertising Prayer Mile on Highway 80 outside of Selma, Alabama, the route taken by participants in 1965 Selma to Montgomery Freedom March. And so that ends that. And so there were about 40 photos. So that is to give you a picture of what has gone on and why things are the way they are. It's not much any different than what's going on today. And that pretty much sums it up. So with that being said, when young people ask questions and want to know why things are the way they are, read history, learn as much as you can learn, stay in school, be strong. And that's the main things that you need to do. And you need to know that these things aren't new. It's sad, but these fights are the same fights that have happened before our parents were here, before your parents were here, before my parents and parents' were here. So the only thing I can leave you with is to stay strong, stay focused, keep your eyes open, learn history, read as much as you can, and be smart. With that being said, thanks for listening. And this is not anything new, people. This is history repeating itself, but it's not a good way. It's not a good way at all. Thanks for listening.